Welcome to the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Melanie Jackson. I'm a clinical and research midwife with my PhD, and each episode I cast a critical eye over current maternity care practice by grappling with research and historical knowledge to help you get the best out of your pregnancy, birth, and postpartum journey. To get access to all the research that I use to create every single podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com. Welcome to today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion. This is a really special one, and one that I felt compelled to deliver after reading what's probably the most compelling research article I've ever encountered. Today's episode is drawn completely and solely from the research article called Challenging the Colonisation of Birth, Koori Women's Birthing Knowledge and Practice, and it draws on historical and archival evidence to help describe and pull together accounts of the birthing practices within Aboriginal communities around Southeast Australia before the time of colonisation. I would encourage you to access this article and read it word for word. It's really easy to access in full text via the Australian Midwifery History Archive, which was collated during a project conducted through the Australian College of Midwives. So all the details for those archives and the full text of this paper are in the resource folder for those who are on the mailing list for this podcast, but they are freely available for anyone else who wants to do a bit of legwork to search the internet for yourself. So in this episode, I'll be using the article to make reference to Aboriginal birth practices and Aboriginal people mentioned throughout the article. In the recounting of the information in this article, I do so with the utmost respect to the Aboriginal people, the original and rightful custodians of this land, which we now call Australia. I acknowledge that we live and work on stolen land and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I also apologise in advance for my potentially poor and uneducated pronunciation of some of the people and place names that are documented in this article. So this article, Challenging the Colonisation of Birth, Koori Women's Birthing Knowledge and Practice, by the authors Karen Adams, Sharon Falkhead, Rachel Stanfield, and Peter Atkinson. It accessed various archived resources that the authors have discovered, researched, collated, and used to generate an account of Koori women's birthing knowledge and practices, and they were able to describe some of what they discovered in this paper and explain the practice and wisdom surrounding Aboriginal birth practices both before and after colonisation. And prior to this article, which was written in 2018, archive materials had never been collated, and so access to this information was poor, and this paper allows access to the collated archival material on Aboriginal women's birthing knowledge and practice. In Southeast Australia, colonisation was particularly brutal and interrupted a 65,000-year-old oral culture, and in Southeast Australia, the process of colonisation actively eroded Aboriginal women's knowledge and practice of birthing. And for those listening who perhaps are not in Australia, or you're overseas, or if you are in Australia and you don't understand what I mean by colonisation, Australia was colonised by Westerners around 1788. In the southeast area of mainland Australia, colonial processes were particularly brutal for Aboriginal people, and after the initial European incursion into the country of the Eora peoples in the Sydney region from 1788, Aboriginal groups whose country is now within the states of New South Wales and Victoria were subjected to widespread dispossession, violence, and introduced diseases in the 19th century as Europeans took up large areas of the country and forced Aboriginal communities into missions and reserves. And these communities in the southeast of Australia felt the effects of European disease before they even met European people. There was smallpox sweeping through Aboriginal populations along the rivers of central and western Victoria from an epidemic that first hit the Aboriginal people in the Sydney region in 1790 and then another in 1830. Once colonisation had begun in Victoria in 1835, the Aboriginal people in that colony were quickly subjected to large-scale settler incursion. And during the 1830s and 1840s, the Western District of Victoria had a reputation as the two worst areas of violence in the colony of New South Wales. In the early years of the colony of Victoria, there were astounding rates of population decline amongst Aboriginal communities, with declines estimated to have been 80% less than 20 years prior. So they essentially exterminated the Aboriginal communities. By the mid to late 19th century, Aboriginal populations were being relocated to missions and reserves and brought under increasing levels of surveillance and subjected to increasing pressure to give up their cultural practices. And this includes practices where governments were enabled to legally remove Aboriginal children from their parents. And this is where we speak about the stolen generations. This process of colonisation impacted on the ability to maintain cultural knowledge, including birthing knowledge and birthing practices. Despite this extraordinary level of colonial interference and genocide, Aboriginal people have staunchly maintained and revived cultural knowledge and practice, and revival began gathering momentum in the 1980s with the repatriation of physical cultural material and management of intangible cultural heritage, such as the sharing of cultural knowledge through the Aboriginal lens. The other thing that's happened through colonisation is that Australian health practices now often omit Indigenous knowledge and focus on illness and pathology that has risen from colonisation that was imposed through Western interference. And now we continue to colonise healthcare by imposing a Western cultural model that is not inclusive of Indigenous modalities of well-being. So challenging the colonisation of birthing through the inclusion of Aboriginal knowledge and practice is imperative if we are to reverse the impact of colonisation on birth practices and outcomes for Aboriginal women. In order for Aboriginal to enact self-determination in their birthing, the women require access to cultural knowledge, and this is essentially derived from two sources. Knowledge and practice retained in families, so this oral tradition, and information contained in institutions. So the aim of this particular research was to collate material on Aboriginal women's birthing knowledge and practice via an archival search for artefacts containing this kind of knowledge pertaining to birth practices. And in the paper, the authors describe the process that they went through in order to collate, collect, and discover these archival resources. It's quite extensive, and I can really appreciate from this paper that they went to painstaking efforts and detail to gather as much as they possibly could. I encourage you to read that section of the paper where they really detail all the efforts and attention that was given to the collection of this archival material. Physical visits were made by one of the authors to public cultural sites, including places like birthing trees, the birthing cave, the Mildura Welcome Baby to Country ceremony, and the Watha Yurong Aboriginal Cooperative Women's Tranquility Garden. And the analysis of the artefact materials occurred with a yarning research method. And this is a research method that supports Indigenous ways of being and assists to decolonise and reposition and support Indigenous knowledge. The authors employed collaborative yarning involving reflection and deep discussion to explore and understand the meaning of artefacts that were collated. For instance, birthing trees were frequently described as places that connected mothers, babies, and community to country. There's this description of a birthing tree in Wollongong, and the quote in the article says, "The big tree at Fig Tree was a birthing tree. We used to be taken there, Muriel, Dido, and myself. We were never allowed to climb up there. Queen Emma Timbury had lots and lots of children, and quite a few of her children were born there. And quite a few of the children that came just before us, 1937, were born there as well. No man would ever go there. the tree that was at Fig Tree that's dead and gone now. There were several birthing trees, and after the baby was born, sometimes the placenta was taken home and buried under a wattle tree that became part of the person's dreaming. And sometimes the placenta was buried under the fig tree. And that information was handed down to me. That's a quote. And anecdotally, the Aboriginal community know of many birthing trees. However, very few are publicly documented. But there is one well-documented birthing tree which is located in Western Victoria under Warrant country and was described as the Aboriginal maternity tree is a giant river red gum, estimated to be about 700 years old. It has a 15-metre girth, and its hollowed-out centre was used as a shelter by the Warrant clan, particularly by Warrant women giving birth. And the tree has fused branches, which this article describes as a method whereby Aboriginal people altered the tree's appearance to signify that it had significance on a cultural map. And it's likely that the larger area surrounding the tree was used as a birthing space as well. For instance, Aboriginal women were identified as using the trees to lean against during birth, and Indigenous women in other parts of Australia have also described using trees to lean against to support a squatting birth position. And giving birth under trees or people being born under trees is really well documented through the oral Indigenous culture. And Stan Grant, a predominant Indigenous man, documented that his maternal grandfather had been born under a tree near Coonabarabran in New South Wales. And Joyce Williams, a Wiradjuri, was born under a tree and her placenta was buried there. And her grandmother told her that the burial of the afterbirth connects you to country. So the birthing trees are highly culturally significant. And the archival materials describe more ways that the trees assisted with labour. So Indigenous women in other parts of Australia tell the story of using the tree branches as part of an active labour tool. For example, in Northern Australia, where Molly Wadagudja, a senior Aboriginal health worker from Gupanga in Arnhem Land, recounts, she says, I said to them, I've got lots of pains, and they said to me, you look, that tree over there, that bending one tree, you go there and you have a little swing up and down, up and down. So I did. And research conducted on women's experience of labour and birth in Maningrida, Arnhem Land, also described the use of trees to assist with labour. So there was one quote which describes that her mother had told her when she had a lot of pain, she should make the baby come out quickly by going to a tree in a bush. She should get a branch of the tree and pull down on it and swing on it up and down, not backward and forward, up and down. And cultural birthing areas are not just associated with trees they discovered through these archives, but birthing caves were also described. And it's similar to the birthing tree that the cave was used in conjunction with the surrounding environment. The article describes that in some parts, when a birth happened near a seashore, it was custom to warm the sand on the sheltered side of a sand hill by making a small fire on it, and then when the babe was born, a hole was scraped and it was placed in it and covered up to the neck with warm sand. And after a lapse of a few hours, it was given to the mother, and her attention to it alone was deemed to be sufficient. It was possible that the fire described in that account was used to sterilize the sand. It assisted to warm the baby and also seal the umbilical cord, which was a practice that was described also in Central Australia. And an elder from South Australia also provided further explanation of using sand with newborn babies to clean and connect the baby to country. And she says, when we were born, grandmother cleans us with the warm sand, not with water. We're cleaned by warm sand, and we're still doing this today. And through this research, it was clear that these places and the conceptual idea of these birthing places continue to connect people to country. In the archives, they also found accounts from Aboriginal women who outlined labour practices and how they provided comfort and prepared a hole in the ground. Jilpia Napaljari Jones describes how her mother's generation gave birth in the Kimberley area in Western Australia. She says, "In my mother's time, birthing was carried out in one's own country with all the rituals and traditions such as squatting over a prepared hole in the ground covered with soft grass and leaves, as well as soft red sand. The female midwives, such as my grandmothers and other designated women, attended to give physical and emotional support such as holding and massage, and this relieved the discomfort of labour. More particularly, it removed fear, and fear is responsible for so many prolonged and complicated labours." And squatting in an upright position during labour is recorded elsewhere, but throughout a lot of the archival evidence that these researchers discovered, women from Maningrida, Arnhem Land, say that the Aboriginal way to birth is to squat with flexed legs. Their heels were under their bottoms and knees spread out. These women said that it was better for the baby to come out straight down, and in this position, women don't feel as vulnerable compared to laying on their back. And the women were encouraged to control the passage of the head and protect the perineum by squeezing their buttocks with their heels. And the archival artifacts also contain material about the care of babies immediately after birth, particularly temperature management as part of the holistic care of the woman and the baby. So as they mentioned earlier, sand was used to clean, warm, and connect the baby to country. And babies were described as being laid in soft, dry grass or wrapped in possum skins. And prior to colonisation, every Aboriginal person had a garment made from possum skins. And these had not been made for hundreds of years until the 1990s, when the method for making these was revived. And there is one maker of these, Mari Clark, describes how possum skin garments connected a person from birth to country and community, and that every Aboriginal person in Southeast Australia would have had a cloak because of the climate down here. You get one as a little baby, and as you grow, the cloak grows with you. And it would have traditional markings of your clan, your family, and who you were. It's almost like an autobiography, having this cloak. And that was a cultural tradition and practice that was lost through the process of colonisation and has recently been revived. In addition to this, the mothers after birth were described as being well cared for, provided food, water, fire, and warmth. It's described that women were being kept warm with hot stones and that the fathers would visit the newborn baby and mother, providing firewood and water. And in addition, the Aboriginal women from the Northern Territory describe the mother and baby being smoked or steamed after the birth. And it's been described as a practice widely done by Aboriginal women. And this article quotes that there is a remarkable similarity of postnatal technique in areas ranging from Cape York and Arnhem Land to the McDonald Ranges in Central Australia. The leaves and plants may vary, but the procedure doesn't alter much. A pit is dug and the medicinal steam producing leaves are placed over a small fire inside. When the fire subsides, the green plants give off a great deal of steam, and the woman who's just given birth is hoisted over the steam by her relatives and squats or sits over the pit so that the steam goes right into her body. The northeast Arnhem Land and steam bath is produced by placing taki rushes or the bark of a stringy bark trees over the fire. And the bark from some plants and other parts of plants are thought to sterilize and cleanse the women with a cleansing medicinal steam used after childbirth. The other thing that this article did was provide some really specific information about Aboriginal midwives. And in Western culture, we've started to lose respect and reverence for midwives as part of our community. Partially that's because the work of midwifery has been hijacked by medicine, and midwifery practices are not necessarily always in servitude to the women. This is different depending on the workplace and the model of care that you provide. However, the practice of midwifery in Western cultures is coming under increasing suspicion because of its connection to medical practices around birth. But that wasn't the case here with Indigenous women. In comparison to descriptions of labour and birth practices, the archives provide an abundance of material on Aboriginal midwives, and these women were described as helping women through their labour and training younger women in midwifery skills. The Gudjit Jamara midwives are described as attending at births and being paid or honoured for their time with possum skins. And there's a quote that says, "During her confinement, her husband lives elsewhere. The neighbouring women's warrants are temporarily deserted and everyone is sent away from the vicinity except 2 married women who stay with her. Should she not have a mother to attend her, a professional woman, a Guinan, is sent for and compelled to nurse her and the baby till she is able to attend to it and to resume the performance of her domestic duties. In return for these services, the nurse is kindly treated and well fed and generally presented with a possum rug." And Aboriginal midwives also attended non-Aboriginal women of the colony to assist in their birthing. So Uncle Lenny Clark describes about how Aboriginal midwives helped with the birth of babies for everyone in southwest Victoria. And he says that when children were born, it was always the Aboriginal female elders that would deliver the children into this world. And not only that, even today, some of the real older people in the white community that will still tell you the stories of some old auntie turning up and delivering their people. And so these elder midwives, they not only delivered children in our community at Framlingham, they also delivered all around in the surrounding areas. And Aboriginal women practicing midwifery continued when the people were moved into missions and reserves. And Aboriginal women practicing midwifery continued when the people were moved into missions and reserves. And Louisa Briggs was described as an expert midwife and nurse. And Aboriginal midwives are described with reverence, admiration and pride. And the ability to name the Aboriginal midwife who was your midwife provided social connection and strengthened identity. And it was described in oral histories where Auntie Laura Bell talks about the Lake Conda and the woman who delivered babies there. The grannies, they were the midwives there. They had the babies like Granny Arden and Granny Foster, and they delivered the babies. Auntie Ivy Marks talks about the midwives at Lake Tyers and the practice of active labour. The midwife was Auntie Ethel Hood, and she was really good with us when we used to have our children. She more or less knew what to do and what not to do. And we never had vehicles to bring us from our houses. We had to walk in labour. We used to walk, and every time I had my children, it was always lightning and thunder or a storm or something. And Uncle Colin Walker talks about this, his grandmother and great-grandmother, and how midwifery skills were handed down. And he says, "I remember when I was a child because my grandmother was a midwife and she had it handed down to her from her mother because my great-grandmother, Auntie Hamilton, was the first midwife around to ever get a certificate, the first Aboriginal woman to get a certificate for a midwife." So it was handed down just like men handed down their culture and knowledge, and the women's business, they did their thing. And Rita Watkins describes the importance of Aboriginal midwives being involved in the birth of children and defying government regulations, which attempted to remove social connection between Aboriginal people. And Rita Watkins says, "I believe the government policies that affected our families' lives did not deter us as Aboriginal people. My mother went back to Lake Tyers so that I could be born with the help of Auntie Julia Thorpe." And Uncle Sandy Atkinson talks about his experience at Kamajunga and the respect that was given to midwives and their cultural position as leaders in the community. And he also describes an important change in practice whereby the imposition of Western medicine starts to undermine the cultural practice of Aboriginal midwifery. And here's where we learn about the importance of midwives within the Aboriginal culture at this time, as described by these archival materials. Being born with the granny midwives was part of the cultural practice, and the dispossession of birth from the country and from the community that occurred when Western medicine starts and when colonisation starts is part of the erosion of the Indigenous culture. Uncle Sandy Atkinson says, "I often tell the story about Nanny Nora. She was like a midwife, and she was sort of somebody special because she could spill across many political boundaries because she was a midwife, and I was delivered by her, and lots of people in my generation was delivered by Nanny Nora. So you could put her in that same category too, because she would be able to front up to the manager who would have looked after her as well. In every Aboriginal society, there would have been these midwives. That was a powerful person in that community. But then come the days later on where they established a little hospital, and so then that was taken away from these women and put in the hands of registered nurses who came there. And Uncle Sandy's story provides an example of how colonisation undermined Indigenous women's position of power and increased colonial control over management of women's bodies. So the displacement of Indigenous midwives was part of a colonising practice to destroy Aboriginal culture, because this article connects Aboriginal midwives to Aboriginal birthing women and land. This collection of archival material provides insight into strong, vibrant and sophisticated Aboriginal birthing knowledge and practice that potentially all women could benefit from. There is a great opportunity for birth-related spaces to be reimagined to include these practices, and the inclusion of Aboriginal birthing knowledge and practice is an opportunity to have an authentic birth model that can empower all women and babies to have strong birthing and connection to country. There are Aboriginal families fortunate enough to birth on their ancestral country, which is crucial for strong and vibrant culture. However, many Aboriginal women no longer have the privilege to birth on country, and for non-Aboriginal women who have migrated to Australia, there is an opportunity for Aboriginal birthing knowledge to provide connection and meaning for these families to Australia's ancient cultural history and identity. Now, this article describes that cultural revitalisation of birthing practices is a two-way process. Firstly, it requires Aboriginal women to be empowered to have access to Aboriginal birthing knowledge and practice. And these women also need access to an understanding of cultural birthing sites such as caves and trees. And these highly respected and significant places of importance deserve great care and appropriate interpretation. And secondly, cultural revitalisation requires non-Aboriginal people to embrace Aboriginal birth knowledge and practice, and to provide space for this and support implementation. Birthing institutions and policies and procedures need to be inclusive of Aboriginal birthing knowledge and practice, with associated employee professional development, and midwifery scholarship also needs to include Indigenous birthing knowledge and practice, in particular addressing the myth that modern Australian nursing and midwifery started with Florence Nightingale, because in fact Australian midwifery has much more ancient and vibrant roots and a component of the oldest continuing culture in the world. I can't recommend this article enough to anybody who's interested in learning about the colonisation of birth and challenging it. And I want to honour the authors of this paper who have gone to painstaking detail to collect and collate these archives and bring this information into a format that's accessible for everybody. To get free access to all the research that's used to create each podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com, or you can join our members hub and financially support the work of this podcast. In the hub, you can ask me questions, and premium members get access to a monthly Q&A episode where I answer listener questions. You'll also get episode transcripts and additional resources for each podcast episode. All the details are in the show notes.